The stars screamed first. Nobody heard them because stars do not make sound in space. But if they did, the sound would have been the kind that breaks bones and stops hearts. Before the light came, before the heat, before the death, the binary stars at the center of Kareth's Vale simply screamed, and then they let go. The station, Conclave Prime, was the most important place in the known galaxy on that day. More than 400 delegates from 31 species sat inside its great halls eating, drinking, arguing, signing treaties that would shape the next 100 years of interstellar history. The Verkai ambassador was laughing at something. The Shenatali medical team was running a diagnostic in the lower bay. The ancient Draveki counselor Orvith sat in his chair at the head of the grand table and thought about how many of these meetings he had survived in his 400 years of life. He thought he would survive this one too. He was wrong. The gamma burst hit Conclave Prime at exactly 347 station time. It did not knock or warn. It did not give time to pray or run. It simply arrived like a wall made of invisible fire, and it passed through every deck, every room, everybody on the station in less than 3 seconds. The lights did not go out. They flickered and stayed on, which was almost worse because for a moment, everyone could see everything. The Verkai ambassador stopped laughing. His silicon armor, which had stopped plasma rounds in 3 separate wars, began to crack along the surface like old pottery, like something ancient being broken by a careless hand. He made a sound that was not a word and sat down very slowly and did not get up again. The Shenatali medical team collapsed together, their bodies, which could regrow, lost limbs in 48 hours, simply stopped. The radiation did not burn them. It went deeper. It found the instructions inside their cells and erased them one line at a time. They were gone before anyone could say their names. Counselor Orvith had time to understand what was happening. He was old enough and wise enough to recognize an Omega-level radiation event. He had read about them. He had read about the dead worlds that resulted from them, the scorched planets, the silent systems. He folded his long gray hands on the table, looked at the ceiling, and said one word in his language. The word meant finished. The station did not explode. It groaned. It bent. Hull sections in the outer ring buckled. The emergency systems tried to activate and mostly failed. Red light replaced white light in the corridors. Doors sealed that were not supposed to seal. Doors opened that were supposed to stay shut. In the Eastern Diplomatic Corridor, the ceiling came down, not all of it, just enough, a section of structural plating 3 meters wide and heavy enough to crush anything beneath it dropped and hit the floor and sent a wave of dust and debris rolling through the hull. Under the edge of that debris, something moved. Day hand came out first, burned at the wrist, covered in gray dust, fingers pressing flat against the floor and pushing a shoulder followed, then a face. Lieutenant Commander Mara Voss pulled herself out of the rubble the way someone pulls themselves out of a bad dream, slowly, and then all at once she had a cut above her left eye that was bleeding steadily. She had 2 cracked ribs, though she did not know that yet. She had radiation burns across the back of her neck and both forearms that would later make the doctors go very quiet when they looked at them. She sat up and looked around the corridor. Everyone else was on the floor. She did not scream. She did not cry. She sat there for exactly 4 seconds, which is how long it took her brain to move from "this is bad" to "what do I do next?" She checked her comes dead. She checked the emergency panel on the wall. Half of it was dark, half of it was not. She read what it told her: life support compromised in sections 4 through 11, structural failure in progress, central ring integrity at 42%, survivor count. The survivor count said calculating. It kept saying calculating. Mara stood up. She was not steady at first. She put one hand on the wall and breathed the way her old drill instructor had taught her a long time ago when she was young and afraid of everything. In through the nose 4 counts, hold 4 counts, out through the mouth 4 counts. She did it twice. Then she stopped being afraid, not because she was brave, not because she was special, because there was simply no time for it. She started walking. The first body she found was a Shenatali technician lying in the middle of the corridor. She checked for a pulse, found a faint one, dragged the technician to the side wall into a position that would keep the airway clear. She had no medical equipment. She used her jacket as a pillow. She moved on. The second body was not alive. She moved on. The third was the Verkai ambassador. He was enormous. The Verkai were a warrior species built like armored vehicles. He outweighed Mara by 300 kilograms. His armor was cracked in 7 places. She found a pulse behind his jaw where the armor did not cover. She grabbed his wrist. She pulled for a long time. The corridor was long and the ambassador was very heavy, and her ribs screamed at her, and the burns on her arms told her to stop, and she did not stop. She pulled him meter by meter toward the emergency airlock at the far end of the corridor where the shielding was strongest, where the structure was still holding, where there was still air being recycled properly. She did not think about why she was alive when no one else was. She did not have time for that question yet. That question would come later, and when it came, it would change everything. Right now, there was only the floor and the weight and the distance between where she was and where she needed to bait. Took her 19 minutes to move him those 40 meters when she finally got the airlock door open and pulled him inside. She sat down for exactly 30 seconds. She counted them. She allowed herself 30 seconds of sitting on the floor of that airlock with her back against the cold wall and her eyes closed and her whole body shaking. Then she opened her eyes. She stood up. She went back into the corridor because somewhere on this dying station there were other pulses. She had felt one already. She would find the rest. She would find all of them, and she would keep them alive, and she would do this because there was no one else. The binary stars outside the viewport still burned. Two cold ancient lights that had just killed a station full of the most important people in the galaxy. Mara Voss walked past the viewport without looking at them. She had work to do. The station was a dead thing that did not know it was dead yet. That was the most dangerous kind. Conclave Prime had been built by 12 species over 20 years. It was the pride of the interstellar conclave, a floating city of diplomacy and science. And careful peace. It had backup systems for its backup systems. It had redundant life support and emergency bulkheads and automated medical drones and a crew of 800 trained for exactly this kind of catastrophe. The automated drones were offline. The crew was on the floor. The backup systems were fighting each other and losing. Mara knew all of this because she had spent the first 40 minutes after waking up doing something that no one had thought to do. She had gone to an emergency panel and read it. She had read every screen that still worked, and she had made a list in her head because she had no paper and no working data slate. What she knew was this life support was failing fastest in the outer ring. She had maybe 6 hours there before the air went bad. 4 of the stasis pods showing survivor readings were in the outer ring. The central corridor structure was cracking slowly. She had maybe 10 hours before sections started to vent. The emergency beacon was transmitting, which meant someone somewhere knew something had happened. What they did not know was whether anyone was alive to be rescued. What she also knew was this: she was alone, completely and totally alone on a station of thousands, and she was the only one walking. She did not let herself think about why she filed that thought away in a part of her mind. She locked with a heavy door, and she did not go near that door. She would open it later when she could afford to. Right now, she moved. She found survivors. The way a person finds anything in a dark, broken building, carefully and slowly, and by going to the places where survivors were most likely to be. She checked every stasis pod indicator she passed. She checked every room with a working door. She learned the sound of the station, its groans and its silences, and she learned which sounds meant danger and which sounds meant the structure was just settling. By the second hour, she had found 9 survivors alive. 8 were unconscious. 1 was not. The one who was not was a Shenatali medic named Alvara. Alvara had survived because she had been inside a radiation-sealed specimen containment unit doing a sample analysis. When the burst hit, the unit had protected her the way a glass jar protects a candle from wind. She was not well. Her hands shook. Her vision came and went. But she was conscious, and she was a doctor, and when she saw Mara walk through the containment door, she stared. She stared the way a person stares at something that should not exist. Mara looked at her and said, "One thing, can you walk?" Alvara said she thought so good. Said Mara, "Help me with the other." Say Alvara helped. She was not strong and she was not well, but she had medical knowledge that Mara did not, and together they moved faster. 2 broken people doing the work of 20. The Shenatali medic kept looking at Mara as they worked, not with fear but with something that scientists feel when they see something that does not fit the map of the world. Something like hunger to understand. She started recording everything on her damaged data slate. The device was cracked and missing half its functions, but the camera still worked and the audio still worked, and Alvara pointed it at Mara every chance. Shigatsu recorded Mara's hands. They were burned. The skin on the back of both forearms was dark and blistered in a way that should have made using them impossible. Mara used them anyway. She used them like they were fine. She used them like the pain was just information, and she had already read that information and filed it away, she recorded Mara. Going into maintenance shaft 7, which according to every radiation sensor on the station had exposure levels that should be lethal to any carbon-based life form. Mara went in with a manual power rerouting tool and spent 11 minutes in that shaft and came back out and reported that Section 9. Life support was now drawing from the secondary grid. She was coughing when she came back. Her eyes were red. She wiped her face on her sleeve and asked Alvara if Survivor 3 was stable, yet Alvara forgot to answer because she was staring. Mara asked again. Alvara said yes and went back to work and kept recording. On the edge of the exclusion zone, the rescue fleet arrived. Admiral Drexel of the Verkai stood on the bridge of his command ship and looked at the sensor readings from Conclave Prime. His species were warriors. They had fought in 7 major interstellar conflicts. They did not frighten easily. He was not frightened now. He was simply unable to accept what the sensors were telling him. There was one biosign moving inside the station. One. He had been told the gamma burst was Omega level. He had seen the atmospheric readings from the surrounding space. The radiation outside the station hull was high enough to make his own crew sick through the shielding of his ship. One biosign moving fast. He asked his science officer to check the sensors again. His science officer checked them again and said that the readings were correct and that the biosign matched the profile of a human. Drexel did not say anything for a moment. Then the comms opened and a voice came through. It was rough. It was tired. It had the particular flatness of a person who has made a decision to feel things later. It said, tell your fleet to prepare medical resources for 19 survivors. Multiple species, various conditions. I will have them in the most shielded section of the station before you can enter the zone. Bring blood plasma, several types. There was a pause and Kofi. Drexel looked at his communications officer. His communications officer looked back at him. The voice on the comms did not wait for a reply. It clicked off. Drexel turned back to the sensor screen and watched that single biosign move through the dead station like something that had not received the message that it was supposed to be dead too. He stood at the exclusion zone border with his fleet behind him and his orders clear, no entry for 72 hours. The radiation levels made entry before that a death sentence for any crew he sent in. He stood there and he watched that one light move. His science officer said quietly that the human biosign was showing physical stress indicators, multiple injuries, elevated cortisol, reduced cellular oxygenation, and still moving, said Drexel. Still moving, confirmed his science officer. The admiral clasped his hands behind his back. The Verkai had a word for what he was feeling. It was an old word from their warrior tradition. It was the word they used when they saw something on a battlefield that made them understand they had been wrong about the limits of what was possible. He said that word very quietly to himself on the station. Mara found the 14th survivor under a collapsed medical cart. She was a young Verkai crew member, barely older than a child. Her armor had saved her. She was unconscious but breathing. Mara checked her over carefully, moved her onto a thermal sheet and looked at her face for a moment. Then she picked her up and carried her down the corridor toward the survivor bay. One more, she said, to know 1/3 and more to find. There is a place inside a human body that other species do not have. It is not an organ. It is not a gland. It has no name in any medical text because no one thought to look for it. Because no one imagined it was necessary. It is the place where a human being goes when everything has been used up, when the pain is too loud and the body is saying stop and the mind is starting to agree. It is the place they go instead of stopping. Mara found that place at hour 11. She had been moving for 11 hours. She had found all 19 survivors. She had moved all 19 of them to the most shielded section of the station, the inner core mechanical bay, which still had working life support and structural integrity and 3 functioning emergency heating units. She had done this alone except for the last 4 hours when Alvara had been strong enough to help more. She had rerouted power twice, crawled through 3 irradiated maintenance shafts, repaired a failing bulkhead seal with her hands, and a manual welding tool, and administered basic emergency care to 11 different species, using whatever she could find in the broken medical supply cabinet. Her left shoulder had stopped working correctly around hour 8. Something was torn. She could still use the arm, but it moved wrong, and the pain when she lifted anything was a white, bright thing that lived behind her. As she had 19 people breathing, she sat down in the corner of the mechanical bay at hour 11, and she put her back against the wall. As she looked at her hands, they were not good hands anymore. They had been ordinary hands before this, a soldier's hands, kept clean and capable. She was proud of them in the simple way a person is proud of a tool that works. They were burned, now blistered from the wrist to the mid-forearm on both sides. The skin had gone dark in places and was weeping fluid in others. One of her fingernails was gone. She did not remember losing it. She looked at her hands for a while, then she started talking. She did not know Alvarez's camera was pointed at her. She was not talking to anyone. She was just talking the way a person talks when they are very alone and very tired and they need something to hold onto that is not made of metal or radiation or fear. She said names: her mother's name, her brother's name, the name of her first commanding officer who had died in a skirmish near the Belith system 6 years ago, the name of a dog she had owned as a child, a brown dog with one white ear whose name was an embarrassing thing she would never say out loud to anyone. She said these names quietly, like she was counting them, like they were the rungs of a ladder. Then she stopped talking. She sat there in the silence of the broken station and breathed, and then she put her hands flat on the floor and she pushed herself up and she stood up. Alvara watched this from across the bay. She had been watching for a long time. She had been recording for a long time on the cracked screen of her data slate. She had hours of footage that she did not fully understand yet, but that she knew was the most important thing she had ever seen. She pointed the camera at her own face and spoke softly. She said she was a genitally biologist with a specialization in xenophysiology. She had spent 30 years studying the biological limits of known species. She said that what she was watching Mara do should not be possible. Then she said something else. She said she thought she understood why it was possible, and the answer was going to change everything on the rescue fleet. Admiral Drexel received Alvarez's fragmented transmissions in pieces. The signal was broken by the radiation and interference, but enough came through. His science officer worked through the night stitching the pieces together. What they assembled was not a report, it was a document of something impossible. Science officer brought it to Drexel at hour 14 and stood beside him while he read the readings Alvara had taken from Mara's biosign. Told a specific story: human cells under omega level radiation exposure did not die the way other species cells died. They did not simply absorb the radiation and collapse. They did something strange. They took the damage, they broke, they repaired, they broke again, they repaired again. They did this over and over at a speed that was frankly offensive to the science officer's understanding of biology, like a wall that grows back faster than it can be. Knockdown, not immunity, the science officer said carefully. Not resistance, she said the word. She meant stubbornness. The admiral looked at her. The science officer said that the human body was not special in any sophisticated way. It was not elegant. It was not advanced. It was, in fact, quite primitive in many of its mechanisms. But it was built on a world that had been trying to kill it for 4 billion years, a world with a young, violent sun, a thin atmosphere, cosmic radiation, heavy metals in the soil, bacteria in the water, creatures with teeth in the dark. The human body had been shaped by all of that into something that did not know how to give up at a cellular level. The DNA repair mechanisms, the redundant organ functions, the sheer number of backup systems in a human body were not signs of advanced evolution. They were signs of a species that had survived by refusing to be killed over and over and over across millions of years until refusing to die was simply what the cells did. The admiral read this in silence. Then he looked at the sensor screen where that single biosign was still moving. The science officer said one more thing quietly and with genuine awe in her voice. She said that the human was not walking through an extinction event. She said that to the human body, an omega level radiation environment was simply a very bad day. Drexel put his hands behind his back and said nothing for a very long time inside. The station counselor Orvith had regained a Small amount of consciousness, he could not move, his body was in deep cellular shock. He was 400 years old, and he had felt death before in the way. That very old living things can feel it like a weather change, like a pressure difference. He felt it now. It was very close. He heard footsteps. He opened his eyes. The human was there, crouching beside him, checking his pulse with 2 burned fingers. Her face was dirty and tired, and the cut above her eye had dried dark. She looked at him with the particular expression of someone solving a practical problem. He used the last of his strength to form words. He asked her why she was not dead. Mara looked at him for a moment. She looked like she was going to say something complicated and then decided against it. She smiled instead. It was a small, tired, real smile. She said she would explain later then. She slid her arms under him very gently, and she began to move him toward the survivor. Verveth closed his eyes. He was afraid he had not been afraid in 200 years, but he was afraid now, not of dying. He had made peace with that. He was afraid because in 400 years of living he had believed he understood the shape of the universe. He had believed he knew what life was capable of, what its edges were, where it ended. He understood now that he had been wrong, and that the thing carrying him through a corridor full of death was the proof. The rescue fleet moved at hour 68. They did not wait for 72. The secondary stellar activity from the binary stars had spiked the radiation in the surrounding space again, and the window for safe entry was closing. The Admiral made the call. He made it without hesitation and without asking permission from anyone above him, because some decisions are made in the body before they reach the mind. He gave one order: we go. Now the ships moved in formation through the exclusion zone boundary. Every crew member was suited in full Omega-rated radiation shielding. The suits were heavy and white, and they made the crew look like they were dressed for the surface of a hostile world, which they were, because space around Conclave Prime had become exactly that. Drexel stood on the bridge and watched the station grow larger on the viewscreen. It looked terrible from the outside. Sections of the outer ring had partially collapsed. Hull plating had peeled away from the structural frame. In 3 places, dark burn marks ran across the station's surface where the gamma burst had hit hardest. It looked like something that had been struck by the hand of a god and left to drift. But it was not dead, the internal sensor sweep confirmed it as they approached. Life support active in the inner core, structural integrity holding in the central sections. 19 biosigns clustered together in the mechanical bay end. 1 biosign slightly apart from the rest, not moving anymore. Admiral Drexel felt something cold move through him when he saw that the 1 biosign that had been moving for 68 hours was now still. He did not say what he was thinking. He simply said faster. They docked at the inner core access point. It took 11 minutes to cut through the sealed emergency bulkhead because someone had welded it from the inside. The cutting crew did not comment on this. They did not have the words for what they were thinking. When the bulkhead came open, the rescue team went through. First medical personnel behind them. The corridor was cold, but not dangerously cold. It smelled of burned metal and recycled air and something else, something the Verkai medic at the front of the team could not name until he looked down and saw the floor thermal sheets, dozens of them, laid out flat and overlapping each other in the corridor outside the mechanical bay door. They were silver and reflective, and they covered the floor from wall to wall, the way a careful person lays out a bed for someone they are worried about getting cold. Rescue team stopped and looked at this. Someone had thought about the corridor floor getting cold and had done something about it. Someone had taken the time. They went through the mechanical bay. Door 19 survivors were inside, arranged with a care that no disaster protocol required. They were not simply placed, they were positioned. Each one on a surface that had been cleared and padded, each one with a thermal sheet, each one positioned in the recovery orientation appropriate for their species. Verkai on their sides, Shinatali flat on their backs with heads elevated, Draveki curled with the spine aligned. Whoever had done this had known the biology of every species in that room. The medical team spread through the bay and began assessment, and every assessment came back the same: alive, stable, unchanged from the last sensor reading. 19 for 19. The Admiral walked through the bay slowly. He looked at each survivor. He looked at how they had been placed. He looked at the stripped thermal sheets and the improvised padding and the small signs. Everywhere of someone solving problems with whatever was available, he walked to the mechanical bay door and looked out into the corridor. She was there. Mara Voss was sitting with her back against the corridor wall outside the bay door. She had pulled her knees up and her arms were resting on them. Her head was down, her eyes were closed. She was asleep. She was asleep in a corridor, with radiation burns on both arms and a damaged shoulder and a head wound, and 68 hours of impossible labor behind her, and she had fallen. Asleep in the corridor outside the door like a guard dog who could not quite make it inside before. The body shut down. Drexel stood in the doorway and looked at her for a long time. He was 412 years old. He had fought in 7 wars. He had stood over the bodies of fallen commanders and wept. He had stood on the bridges of burning ships and made decisions that history would call legendary. He had seen things that others called impossible and had made them possible through will and discipline and strength. He had never in his 412 years felt what he felt. In that corridor, his second-in-command came to stand beside him and looked at Mara, and then looked at him. The admiral said, "Bring the honor litter." His second-in-command said the honor litter was reserved for Verkai generals who had fallen in combat. The admiral said he was aware of what it was reserved for. His second-in-command went to get the honor litter. The medical team came out to assess Mara. They worked quickly and quietly. Her radiation exposure was logged, and the number made the lead medic go still for a moment and read it again, and then say nothing and write it down. They cataloged the burns, the shoulder injury, the head wound, the cracked ribs, the general cellular exhaustion that showed up in every biological reading. None of it was as bad as it should have been. None of it was anywhere close to as bad as it should have been. Lead medic pulled the admiral aside and said this quietly with the careful voice of a professional, trying not to sound like they were describing a miracle. She said Mara's body had taken damage that would have killed any crew member on this rescue fleet, regardless of their radiation suit. She said the cellular repair happening in real time in Mara's tissue was unlike anything in any medical database. She said she wanted to be precise and scientific about this, and not emotional. Then she stopped being precise and scientific. She said she did not understand how the human was alive, and she said it plainly like an admission. Drexel nodded. Honor litter arrived. 4 of his strongest crew members carried it. It was a flat platform edged in dark metal with the Verkai military emblem on each corner. It had carried dead generals off battlefields. It had carried living ones out of burning ships. They lifted Mara onto it gently. She stirred slightly when they moved her damaged shoulder. She made a small, sharp sound, and her eyes, half open edge, looked up at the ceiling of the corridor and then at the faces around her. She said one word, "Coffee." Nobody laughed, not because it was not funny, but because something about this woman asking about coffee while being carried on a military honor litter out of an Omega-level disaster zone made something happen in the chest that was not quite laughter and not quite tears. The admiral stepped forward so she could see his face. He was Admiral Drexel, commander of the 7th Verkai Fleet, decorated veteran of the Beleth conflict, the Rim Wars, and the siege of Omara Station. He did not bow to anyone. He bowed to her. It was a small bow. The Verkai do not make large gestures. Their small ones mean more, he said. I brought it myself. Her eyes were closing again. She was already going back under, pulled down by the sleep. Her body had been demanding for hours, but she smiled. It was not a small smile this time. It was a real one, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and honest. The kind that belongs to a person who has done the thing they needed to do and knows it. They carried her out through the corridor, past the thermal sheets she had laid on the floor, through the access point and out into the docking arm. Every member of the rescue crew was standing in the corridor as she passed. They had not been ordered to stand there. They were simply there, the way people gather without being asked when they understand they are watching something that will be told in stories long after they are gone. Not one of them spoke. The binary stars burned cold and distant outside the viewport. Mara Voss went past them, carried on the shoulders of warriors, and she did not see the stars, and she did not see the crew standing at attention, and she did not see the admiral walking beside her with his hands clasped behind his back and his jaw set tight. She was asleep. She had earned it. They expected her to be broken for a long time. Every doctor on the medical station said the same thing in different ways. They said it gently, they said it carefully, the way doctors say things they believe are true and necessary even when they know The patient does not want to hear them. They said that the human body had limits and that Mara Voss had gone past those limits and that recovery would take months and possibly longer. Mara was discharged in 11 days, not because she demanded it, not because she refused treatment. She was patient and cooperative, and she did everything they asked. She let them scan her and sample her and study her with the focused, desperate attention of the most brilliant medical minds in the known galaxy. She answered their questions honestly. She ate what they gave her. She slept when they told her to. She simply healed faster than they had planned for. On day 11, the lead doctor stood in her room and looked at the results of her final scan and looked at her and said that, medically speaking, there was nothing left to treat. She said great and asked about her jacket. They had burned her jacket because of radiation contamination. They gave her a new one. The Verkai military had sent it. It was a dress jacket in Verkai, formal black, with her rank insignia on the collar and the Conclave Prime rescue mission date stitched inside the left cuff in small, careful letters. She put it on and looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. She did not look like someone who had survived an extinction event. She looked like a tired woman in a very nice jacket. She decided that was fine. Elvira found her in the corridor outside the medical ward. She was standing at a viewport looking at the stars. Not the binary stars of Careth's Vale. Those were weeks behind them now, just ordinary stars. The kind that did not kill. Elvira stood beside her, and for a while neither of them said anything. Then the Shenatali biologist said she owed Mara an explanation. She said that she had done something without permission. She had recorded everything, and she had submitted the recordings and her full biological analysis to the Conclave Science Division and to the Medical Board and to 6 independent research institutions. Mara turned to look at Hirovara, said she was sorry. She said she had not asked because she had not known how to ask. She had not known how to say to someone, please let me tell the universe what you are, because I do not think you understand it yourself. Mara was quiet for a moment. She asked what Alvara's findings said. Alvara told her. She told her about the cellular repair mechanisms. She told her about the radiation tolerance and the redundant organ systems and the 4 billion years of a sun that burned too bright in a world that wanted its inhabitants dead. She told her about the conclusion she had written at the end of her report, which said that humans were not a developing civilization finding their place in the galaxy. She said the conclusion called humans something else. She said the word apex survivor species. Mara looked at her and then looked back at the stars. She said that was a lot of words for a stubborn. Elvira laughed. It was the first time since before the burst that she had laughed. It surprised her, and she put her hand over her mouth and her eyes went bright. And then she was not laughing anymore. She was crying, and she did not try to stop it. She said she had thought Mara was going to die. She said she had watched through that sensor screen, and she had been certain that each hour would be the last one. Each time the biosign slowed, she had stopped breathing herself. Each time it moved again, she had let herself breathe. She said she had recorded everything because she needed to do something, because she could not help, and recording was the only thing she had. Mara looked at her. She put her burned hand over Alvara's hand on the viewport. The burns were mostly healed now. Pink new skin over the worst places. She said Alvara had helped. She said the recordings were going to help more people than either of them could count right now. She said thank you, and she said it in Shenatali, which she had spent 3 nights learning the basics of in the medical ward between scans. Elvira stared at her. Then she held herself together and nodded, and that was all. The conclave session was held 4 weeks after the disaster at Careth's Vale. It was the most attended session in the conclave's history. Every species sent their full delegation. Every seat was filled. The gallery above was packed with observers who had traveled from the edges of known space to be there. The first item was Alvara's biological report and the resulting reclassification proposal. Counselor Orvith presented it himself. He stood at the head of the chamber, and he did not read from notes. He was 400 years old. He had seen empires form and dissolve. He had signed 40 treaties and broken 2, and survived both. He was the oldest living member of the conclave and the most respected. He stood there, and he told them what had happened. Not the official version, not the sanitized diplomatic summary, the real version, the version where a station full of the most powerful beings in the galaxy collapsed in 3 seconds, and a human woman got up from the rubble and went to work. He told them about the thermal sheets on the floor. That was the part that got them, the thermal sheets on the floor of a dying corridor, when there was no protocol that required them, no regulation that asked for them. They were just there because someone had thought a cold floor was a problem that could be fixed and had fixed it. The chamber was very quiet when he finished. He said one more thing. He said that in 400 years he had asked many questions and received many answers. He said there was one question he had asked in a broken corridor on a dying station that he had not received an answer to. Yet he said the human had promised to explain later. He looked directly at Mara, where she sat in the diplomatic gallery. He said he would like the answer. Now every head in the chamber turned. Mara had not been warned this was coming. She sat very still for a moment in her Verkai dress jacket with the date stitched inside the cuff. Then she stood up. They brought her to the podium. She stood in front of the full interstellar conclave under the lights of the great chamber, and 400 delegates from 31 species looked at her the way people look at things they are trying to understand and cannot quite reach. She looked back at them. She thought about the corridor. She thought about her hands. She thought about the names she had said in the dark when she needed something to hold on to. She thought about a brown dog with one white ear. She said, "We have had a rough few billion years," she said it simply, not as a boast, not as a speech, just as a fact, the way someone states a fact they have lived inside for so long it no longer surprises them. She said, "Our sun was young and angry when we were young and small. Our world was not kind to us. Our seas wanted to drown us. Our skies wanted to burn us. The other creatures wanted to eat us, and the ground itself was full of things that killed." She said, "We did not win that fight by being stronger or smarter or better than everything that tried to kill us." She said, "We won it by being harder to finish than anything had patience for." She said, "That is all we are. We are not special. We are not chosen. We are just the result of something that tried to die for 4 billion years and kept failing at it." She paused. She looked at Orveth, said, "That is why she was not dead." The chamber was silent, and then the Verkai ambassador in the front row performed the warrior's bow, the deepest one reserved for commanders who had done something that changed the outcome of a battle. He was still cracked along his armor in 7 places. He did not look like a man who should be performing deep bows. He did it anyway, and then the delegate beside him moved, and the one beside them, and the sound that came from the chamber was not applause. It was something older than applause. It was the sound of many different bodies, all making their own gesture of the same feeling at the same time. 1,000 different movements aimed at one woman. At a podium, Mara stood there and received it. She did not cry, not then. She was not built for crying in front of people. She would cry later in a small private room with no camera and no witnesses, and she would cry for all of it, for the burns and the cold corridor and the names she had said in the dark, and the 19 people breathing who had not been breathing before, and the dog with one white ear and all of it. But right now she stood after the session. Orveth found her in the corridor. He moved slowly. His recovery was long and would continue to be long. He stood in front of her and looked at her. The way he had looked at her in that corridor when he had asked his question, he had the same expression. A man confronting the edge of what he thought was possible. He said he had one more question. He said he wanted to know what the dog's name was. She looked at him. She looked at this 400-year-old alien counselor who had survived an extinction event and crossed the galaxy to be here, and was asking her about a dog. She told him the dog's name, and it was an embarrassing name. The name of a child who had loved something very much and had not worried about dignity when naming it. Orveth said it was a good name. He said it very seriously, the way he said everything. Mara nodded. She looked down the corridor at the great window. At the far end, at the stars beyond, ordinary beautiful stars that did not kill you, she said. Yes, she said, it was a very good name.